Some villages are forgotten not just by maps, but by time itself. Places where the outside world seems a distant dream, and people live bound to the harsh rhythms of survival. But what happens when hopelessness meets cunning minds capable of bending reality itself? In 1962, one such village, Yerba Buena, became the stage for events so dark, so profoundly human, that they defy belief. This is the story of how ordinary families were drawn into a nightmare that would change them forever. Part 1: The Arrival of Darkness. In the Sierra Madre Oriental mountains, where the Mexican terrain folds into hidden valleys, there are communities untouched by modern life. Small farming villages survive in isolation, 6 miles from the nearest road, 15 miles from any police, with no school, no church, and no authority to intervene in their lives. One of these communities, Yerba Buena, would soon become infamous, not for nature, not for poverty, but for the human darkness that entered its gates. In late 1962, 50 villagers lived in Yerba Buena, part of 23 families eking out a living from small plots of corn and beans. Life was harsh. Most adults had never learned to read, and many had never traveled more than a few dozen miles from where they were born. Their lives followed the same patterns for generations, shaped by isolation and tradition. The region itself fed local legends. Ancient tales spoke of hidden treasures in caves carved into the mountains, treasures left by pre-Columbian civilizations. These stories, passed down orally, grew richer with every retelling. And in this isolated world, belief in the supernatural was not just accepted, it was respected. Spiritism had taken root across rural Mexico, a mixture of Catholicism, indigenous beliefs, and European mysticism. To the villagers, spirits could communicate, gods could intervene, and miracles could happen. The harvest of 1962 had been poor, leaving families desperate. Food was scarce, and the coming winter threatened real suffering. It was at this moment of vulnerability that two men appeared on the trail leading to Yerba Buena. Santos and Cayetano Hernandez, brothers with years of petty crime behind them, entered the village with promises that seemed too miraculous to refuse. Their plan was simple yet terrifyingly effective: total control. They claimed to be messengers of Inca gods, exiled long ago, now returned to reward those who proved faithful. For outsiders, this might seem absurd. The Incas lived far away, in Peru, but the villagers did not question the origin. The promise of gold and silver hidden in mountain caves was enough. Within a week, the brothers had established authority. They demanded offerings of food, claiming it was necessary to show devotion to the gods. For starving families, surrendering a portion of their harvest was a small price for divine favor. But Santos and Cayetano's ambitions were larger than food. They introduced rituals that were incomprehensible, even horrifying, to outsiders. Sacred substances like peyote and marijuana were consumed. Acts of physical devotion were demanded. And slowly, a system of control developed that involved the exploitation of the most vulnerable. At first, it was a 14-year-old girl, believed by her parents to be helping secure divine blessings for the village. Over time, participation expanded to married women, conducted under the influence of drugs and ritualistic ceremonies in the caves that surrounded the village. Observers were drawn in, including children, who were initially passive, later manipulated into active participation. By early 1963, the brothers had grown ambitious. The promised treasures had not appeared, and whispers of rebellion began to circulate among the villagers. The brothers knew they needed a new spectacle, a demonstration that could not be questioned. It had to be miraculous. It had to be a living God. At this critical moment, they recruited Magdalena Solis, an 18-year-old from Monterrey. Magdalena had spent her life in exploitation and abuse, surviving on the streets and in the arms of those who sought to control her. But she was clever, imaginative, and desperate for power, even temporary. When offered the chance to become a living goddess in Yerba Buena, she accepted. The brothers orchestrated her introduction with theatrical precision. A large cave with an antechamber became the altar, torches casting flickering shadows. Magdalena was adorned in a white tunic, her body painted with symbols claimed to be sacred. The villagers were summoned under the cover of night. Smoke and incense filled the air, disorienting their senses. At the climax of the ritual, a small explosive flash sent clouds of smoke into the cave. When it cleared, Magdalena stood on the altar as if emerging from nowhere. To the villagers, who had never seen anything like it, she was divine. She was real, she was magic, and from that night, the transformation of Yerba Buena into a village of submission, terror, and unthinkable acts had begun. But this was only the beginning. What the villagers didn't know, what no one could predict, was how deep the horrors would go, how completely the brothers and Magdalena would manipulate not just obedience but belief itself. In the months to come, lives would be broken, families torn apart, and innocence consumed. The story of Yerba Buena was only beginning, and the darkness had arrived in full. This version keeps the horror real and psychological, sets the stage for part 2, and uses clear, simple English ideal for YouTube narration. It's written to hook the audience in the first paragraph and leave them wanting more. If you want, I can continue with part 2, keeping the same style, and escalate the horror into the rituals, disappearances, and the psychological grip the brothers had over the villagers. Do you want me to move on to part 2 next? Title: The Horrors of Yerba Buena, Part 2. The Goddess Emerges. Hook. Opening. In Yerba Buena, a single night changed everything. What began as fear and desperation now spiraled into obsession and blind devotion. An ordinary girl became a goddess, and a village that had once tilled the earth in silence now trembled under her command. But what happens when power meets delusion, and the line between pretend and reality disappears entirely? Part 2. The Goddess Emerges. The night Magdalena appeared on the altar, smoke curling around her like a veil, the villagers of Yerba Buena believed the impossible. They had seen a miracle, a manifestation of the divine, and they fell to their knees. Some wept quietly, others trembled, afraid even to breathe. Santos prostrated himself before her and proclaimed that they were in the presence of Cotlicu, the Aztec goddess of earth and death, returned to guide them. Magdalena spoke in a strong, commanding voice, repeating lines she had rehearsed. She had seen their devotion, she was satisfied, and their faith would be rewarded. But within her, something extraordinary, and terrifying, had begun to take root. Her life of invisibility and abuse had left her with little sense of self, no boundaries, no certainty about what was real or imagined. Now, 50 people treated her as divine. They obeyed her without hesitation. And her mind, already fragile, began to fracture further. Within days, Magdalena no longer pretended to be a goddess. In her own perception, she was Cotlicu. The change was gradual, but her followers noticed it clearly. 1 week after her revelation, during a midnight ceremony, she stopped mid-sentence. Her eyes rolled back, her hands twisted into strange, almost unnatural shapes, and a stream of rapid, incomprehensible sounds poured from her mouth. It was not the rehearsed, fake language the Hernandez brothers had taught her. This was something different, urgent, chaotic, a torrent of syllables and cries no one could understand. The brothers froze. For a moment, they feared the performance was out of control. But Santos quickly recovered, declaring that Magdalena was now receiving messages directly from the gods. The villagers bowed lower, terrified and awestruck. Only Eliezer, Magdalena's brother and lifelong confidant, understood the truth. This trance was not a performance. She had experienced something deeply real within her own mind. When her eyes returned to focus on the villagers, there was no trace of the girl from Monterrey, no trace of Magdalena the prostitute. There was only a goddess, watching, judging, commanding. With this transformation, power shifted. The Hernandez brothers, once the orchestrators, became secondary. Magdalena now dictated the rules. She demanded increasingly elaborate rituals, and her focus soon extended beyond adults. Children were not spared. Participation in the ceremonies became universal, as drug use spread to everyone. Smoke, incense, and hallucinogenic substances filled the caves each night, amplifying fear and suggestibility. Sleep deprivation kept the villagers in a state of constant psychological vulnerability, and exhaustion combined with altered perception to suppress resistance. Almost immediately, the change brought horrifying consequences. People who once thought themselves safe within the patterns of village life began to experience a new reality. Nothing could be refused. No one could question her authority. In early April, two young adults, Juan and Manuel, decided they had endured enough. Under cover of night, they made plans to escape, hoping to return to the nearest town and distance themselves from the growing madness. But in a village where everyone had been watching, whispering, obeying, their intentions did not remain secret. Magdalena discovered the plan before the young men could act. Her reaction was instantaneous. She called an emergency ceremony, commanding that everyone attend. At the cave, she pointed directly at Juan and Manuel and declared them heretics, betrayers of the gods. She claimed to see inside their minds, to know their intentions. And the only way to cleanse such betrayal, she said, was with blood. The villagers hesitated. Even under drugs and exhaustion, the idea of harming neighbors, people they had known all their lives, was difficult. Magdalena, sensing weakness, erupted in fury. She proclaimed that anyone who refused to participate was equally guilty. Eliezer and the Hernandez brothers stepped forward first, demonstrating the seriousness of the command. What followed was a horrifying display of human psychology at its most vulnerable. One by one, villagers joined the violence. Parents, children, siblings, and neighbors, entire families, participated in the brutal execution. Stones crushed bodies, sticks inflicted wounds, and tools became instruments of terror. The screams and chaos lasted nearly an hour. When the bodies stopped moving, Magdalena commanded that they be burned. The act of killing, once unimaginable, had become normalized. The psychological barrier had been shattered. In that moment, Magdalena cemented her absolute power. Life and death were now hers to command. From this point, the rituals grew darker. Magdalena began devising what she would later call the blood ritual. These ceremonies were designed not only to terrorize, but to test loyalty, manipulate devotion, and escalate the villagers' obedience. Drug use became mandatory, and the youngest villagers were forced to inhale smoke or ingest hallucinogens to ensure they would remain pliable. Sleep deprivation, fear, and the spectacle of violence created a state where resistance was nearly impossible. Villagers who might have objected now accepted the rituals as divine law. By combining trauma, manipulation, and altered perception, Magdalena had created a psychological prison without walls, where obedience was the only path to survival. The Hernandez brothers, once the ultimate authority, became minor figures in the unfolding nightmare. They still enjoyed the rewards, food, drugs, and the attention of women, but it was clear who now ruled. Magdalena's delusion of divinity was complete. She no longer acted under their guidance. She acted as a goddess, and the village obeyed her unquestioningly. By the end of April, Yerba Buena had been transformed. Fear and reverence had fused into a single force. Magdalena, lost in her own divine persona, had begun exercises of power that would escalate into unimaginable horrors. And yet, this was only the beginning. For the villagers, one brutal question now dominated every thought: who could defy a goddess without risking death? This version keeps the story gripping and horrifying, builds the psychological tension, and sets up part 3 to explore how the blood ritual and total control over the villagers escalates. If you want, I can continue part 3 next, focusing on the blood ritual, the further manipulation of children, and the village's descent into complete terror. Do you want me to move on with part 3? Title: The Horrors of Yerba Buena, Part 3: The Blood Ritual. Hook opening. In Yerba Buena, fear and devotion had fused into a terrifying new order. What started as obedience became participation, and participation became obsession. The villagers had crossed a line from which there was no return. And at the center of it all was Magdalena, who no longer saw herself as human, only as a goddess demanding blood. Part 3: The Blood Ritual. After the first 2 murders, Magdalena's ambitions grew darker, her rituals more twisted. She created what she called the blood ritual, a ceremony designed to assert her power, test obedience, and terrify the villagers into complete submission. On the surface, it appeared simple: sacrifice and consumption. But in reality, it was a calculated horror that transformed the community and shattered their humanity. At first, the rituals involved minor self-inflicted wounds. Villagers cut their arms, letting blood drip into a ceremonial chalice. Magdalena combined this with blood from sacrificed chickens and powdered hallucinogens, peyote and cannabis, creating a potion she drank first. Witnesses expected hesitation, disgust, some trace of human decency. There was none. She drank deeply, eyes closed, a look of ecstatic satisfaction on her face. Slowly, she licked the rim, ensuring not a single drop was wasted. Then the chalice passed to others. Eliezer, her brother, drank. The Hernandez brothers drank. Soon, every villager present, including the youngest, was forced to take part. Refusal meant certain accusation of heresy. The psychological impact was profound. Drinking human blood, voluntarily or under coercion, created complicity that chained the villagers to the rituals. The first step had been taken, a moral boundary had been crossed. But voluntary blood was no longer enough for Magdalena. She believed she now needed involuntary sacrifices, victims chosen against their will, to feed the gods and purify the village. She claimed the gods were disappointed, that non-believers still lurked among them, and only their deaths could restore favor. Her proclamations created a constant climate of fear. Any hesitation, any wrong expression could mark a villager for execution. During the day, life in Yerba Buena maintained a grim illusion of normalcy. After nights of smoke, drugs, and blood, villagers returned to their homes for a few hours' sleep. Then, under exhaustion and hallucinatory influence, they worked the fields. Corn, beans, livestock, tasks continued, but conversation was minimal. Prolonged eye contact was dangerous, silence was safer. Even the children's play lacked joy, their movements quiet, cautious. By late April, Magdalena selected her first true blood victim. A middle-aged man, accused of impurity, was brought before the village during the ritual. He denied the charges, pled his devotion, promised obedience, but Magdalena was relentless. Judgment had been made. The ceremony was designed to prolong terror. The victim was stripped and tied to the stone altar. Villagers, under her command, beat him with sticks, cut superficial wounds with knives, and torches were applied to scorch his skin. The goal was not to kill swiftly but to demonstrate power, instill fear, and create a shared sense of complicity. Entire families participated, parents alongside children, neighbors alongside siblings. Any hesitation was met with force or threat. One particularly harrowing moment involved two brothers. Magdalena chose one for the ritual. The remaining brother faced a horrifying choice: comply or witness his sibling's suffering. Trembling, he picked up a stick and began the beatings, eyes locked with his brother's, who silently conveyed terror, understanding, and an unspoken forgiveness. When it ended, the surviving brother vomited. No one consoled him. Something inside him had died along with his brother's screams. The ritual did not end there. Magdalena insisted on completing the execution in the style of ancient Aztec rites. The heart of the victim, still beating, was to be removed. Eliezer, using knowledge gained from animal slaughter, performed the act. The incision, made with a hunting knife, sliced through flesh and bone, producing horrific sounds. Hands plunged into the chest cavity, tearing tissue, until the organ was freed. Magdalena raised it high, blood dripping down her arms and staining her white tunic red. The blood was collected in chalices and passed among villagers. Some vomited immediately, others drank silently, broken or drugged into submission. Victims' bodies were left in corners, sometimes partially burned, decomposing in the humid caves. The stench of old blood, charred flesh, incense, and sweat made the air nearly unbreathable. Flies swarmed, larvae developed, yet the ceremonies continued weekly, sometimes more often. The selection of victims seemed arbitrary. Some were accused of doubt, others chosen without clear reason. Yet over time, something even darker emerged. Some villagers began anticipating the rituals, taking pleasure in inflicting pain. The violence had awakened a latent cruelty within them, a sadistic instinct that Magdalena's manipulation had allowed to flourish. One of the most disturbing incidents involved a young woman named Selena. Chosen for sacrifice, she had been completely psychologically broken. By this point, she believed offering her blood was an honor, that it would nourish the gods. She approached the altar joyfully, murmuring prayers. Her boyfriend, Hector tried to intervene, desperate to save her. Selena resisted, urging him to use a stone to crush her skull if he truly loved her. A mercy, she said, a guarantee of divine favor. Hector's heart shattered. Before he could act, other villagers pulled him away, overpowering him. Semi-conscious, he was forced to watch the unimaginable unfold. Selena's life ended, her blood collected, her body treated as ritual sacrifice. Hector's screams echoed in the cave, unanswered. For him, the reality of Magdalena's power, and the complete moral collapse of the village, became undeniable. By the end of May, Yerba Buena had transformed into something unrecognizable. Drugged, terrorized, and psychologically bound, the villagers were enslaved to rituals of violence and devotion. Magdalena's delusions grew with each ceremony. Her authority was absolute. Resistance had become impossible. And yet, the story was far from over. The horrors of the blood ritual had begun, but the true descent into madness, into human cruelty beyond comprehension, had only just started. This version maintains clear, gripping storytelling, emphasizes the psychological horror and descent into sadism, and builds directly to Part 4, where the ritual escalation and full collapse of morality will continue. If you want, I can draft Part 4 next, focusing on the continued escalation of sacrifices, the villagers, moral collapse, and Magdalena's godlike control. Do you want me to continue with Part 4? Title: The Horrors of Yerba Buena, Part 4. The Village Descends. Hook opening. In Yerba Buena, terror had become routine. Fear, devotion, and blood now ruled daily life. What started as obedience had transformed into a darkness no one could escape. Every villager lived in constant terror of Magdalena's gaze, yet some began to crave the violence, the power, the chaos. The village had changed forever, and the goddess was only growing stronger. Part 4. The Village Descends. By early June, the village of Yerba Buena had lost all sense of normalcy. What had once been a quiet community of farmers now operated under the strict and brutal dictates of Magdalena, the self-proclaimed goddess. Nightly ceremonies had become central to life, and every moment of the day was dominated by fear, exhaustion, and drug-induced confusion. The blood ritual, introduced in April, had become the cornerstone of her control. Each ceremony escalated in intensity. Initially, villagers had hesitated, but repeated participation had erased moral boundaries. They now acted with a disturbing mix of fear, devotion, and emerging cruelty. Some had begun anticipating the rituals, eager to demonstrate loyalty, while others submitted silently, too broken to resist. Magdalena's power had grown beyond anything the Hernandez brothers could imagine. The brothers had once controlled the village with promises and manipulation, but now they existed solely to serve her whims. Eliezer, her brother, remained by her side, assisting with the gruesome tasks and ensuring the rituals ran smoothly. Even he, intimately familiar with Magdalena's mind, could not stop the tide of violence she had unleashed. The villagers had been trained, both physically and psychologically, to obey. Sleep deprivation, constant drug use, and fear of accusation had made resistance impossible. Every morning, after nights of hallucinogenic smoke, blood, and screams, they returned to the fields to work, silent, tired, and hollow-eyed. Conversation was minimal, eye contact dangerous. Children learned quickly that attention could be fatal. They played quietly near their homes, their innocence slipping away as they watched their elders commit acts of horror. By mid-June, Magdalena's delusions had expanded. She claimed the gods demanded not only obedience but ritualized displays of violence from specific families. The selection seemed arbitrary, yet there was a hidden logic only she understood. Each victim was accused of harboring doubt or impurity, though often it was enough that someone simply displeased her gaze. One evening, Magdalena pointed at a man named Tomas, a quiet farmer who had spoken too softly during a ceremony. He protested, denied any wrongdoing, but the goddess would not be swayed. Tomas was brought to the stone altar, stripped, tied, and surrounded by his neighbors. Fear, drug haze, and conditioning left them unable to resist. The ceremony began slowly, almost ceremonially. Villagers struck Tomas with sticks, cut shallow wounds with knives, and held torches near his skin. The ritual was designed to prolong suffering, to emphasize Magdalena's absolute authority. Entire families participated. Fathers, mothers, and children all took turns, reinforcing the lesson: obedience was survival, cruelty was worship. Eleazar prepared for the final act. Tomas' chest was cut open with a hunting knife, bone cracked, hands plunged inside to extract the still-beating heart. Magdalena raised it high, blood dripping from her arms, her white tunic stained crimson. The chalice of blood was passed around, forcing every participant to drink. Some vomited, others drank silently. The smell of blood, incense, sweat, and decay made the cave almost unbreathable. As the weeks progressed, the village's moral compass eroded further. Certain villagers began to anticipate the rituals with grim excitement. They volunteered to strike, to cut, to punish, sometimes before Magdalena commanded it. Fear had evolved into a dark, shared desire for participation. Violence had become a currency of power, a way to gain favor with the goddess. The next ritual brought something even more disturbing. Magdalena selected a teenage girl named Isabella, whose parents had resisted the influence of drugs and fear longer than most. When chosen, Isabella begged for mercy, pleading with her parents to intervene. Her parents, terrified of being accused of heresy themselves, complied with the goddess' orders. They struck their own child, hesitated only briefly before the crowd forced them to continue. Isabella's screams echoed through the cave, mingling with the stench of blood and incense. The villagers were silent observers and participants simultaneously. By the end of the ritual, the girl's heart had been removed, her blood consumed, and the chalice passed once more. The once thriving village had become a theater of death, a place where violence was ritual, submission was survival, and horror was normalized. The psychological impact was profound. Parents forced their own children to participate, teaching them that cruelty was divine. Children learned that obedience, even to the point of murder, was necessary. Any hesitation could mean accusation, torture, or death. Over time, the lines between fear, devotion, and perverse excitement blurred. Hector, still traumatized from Selena's sacrifice, tried to resist silently. But he could not ignore the new reality. Families anticipated the next victim, volunteered to strike first, and embraced the rituals with horrifying fervor. Every ceremony strengthened Magdalena's authority and broke the villagers' remaining resistance. By late June, Magdalena's delusions had grown even larger. She now claimed the gods demanded more than blood, they demanded spectacle, ritualized displays of obedience and terror for every family. Villagers were pushed to their limits. Drugged, starved of sleep, and surrounded by death, they continued to obey. Some whispered doubts among themselves in secret, but any misstep could mean selection for the altar. The goddess' influence had spread beyond fear into addiction. Fear of accusation, drug-induced euphoria, and forced participation had created a cycle of compliance impossible to break. Even those who might have resisted had been reshaped, transformed into instruments of the goddess' cruelty. By the end of June, Yerba Buena was no longer a village, it was a kingdom of terror, with Magdalena as its undisputed ruler. Fear, obsession, and delusion had reshaped human nature itself. Every ritual, every murder, every sip of blood reinforced the goddess' authority and the villagers' submission. Yet, even in this darkness, small sparks of hesitation remained. Few whispered of escape, few dreamt of defiance. But every day, those dreams faded under the weight of terror. The village had descended into chaos, but the story of Magdalena's dominion was far from over. The blood ritual had only begun, and the goddess' hunger for control and worship continued to grow. This version emphasizes psychological terror, moral collapse, and ritual escalation, setting the stage for Part 5, where the rituals spiral further, and the full horror of Magdalena's control deepens. I can continue with Part 5, where the blood ritual intensifies, more villagers are broken, and the first hints of rebellion appear. Do you want me to continue with Part 5 next? Title: The Horrors of Yerba Buena, Part 5. The Rituals Deepen. Hook opening. In Yerba Buena, fear had become a way of life, but fear alone was no longer enough. Magdalena, now fully lost in her delusions of godhood, demanded more than obedience. She demanded devotion through terror. And as the blood rituals intensified, the villagers' humanity unraveled completely. Part 5. The rituals deepen. By mid-July, the village of Yerba Buena had become a kingdom of shadows and screams. Daylight brought only fleeting relief. By evening, the caves filled with smoke, blood, and whispers of the divine. The villagers lived in constant anticipation of the next ritual, drugged, exhausted, and mentally fractured. Magdalena's blood ritual had become a full-scale operation. No longer limited to a few victims each week, she now demanded multiple sacrifices during each ceremony. Families were instructed to bring their own children to witness the rites, to ensure the teachings of obedience and cruelty were passed to the next generation. The line between horror and indoctrination had vanished entirely. One night, she selected 3 villagers at once. A young man named Rafael, a woman named Marta, and a child of just 12 years, Diego. Each was accused of harboring doubt or disobedience, though the reasons were often arbitrary, based purely on Magdalena's whims. Fear and drugs ensured compliance, but even that could not prepare the villagers for what would come next. The victims were brought to the altar, stripped and tied, their faces reflecting terror and disbelief. Magdalena circled them like a predator, chanting in a mixture of her own invented language and fragmented Aztec phrases. Smoke filled the cave, incense masking the metallic tang of blood from prior rituals. Eliezer, now a skilled executioner, prepared the hunting knife for the first extraction. The ritual began with prolonged beatings, knives scraping skin, torches searing flesh. The screams echoed off the cave walls, creating a haunting symphony of agony. Villagers participated fully, some driven by fear, others by the dark excitement that had begun to emerge. Then came the moment of truth, the hearts. Raphael's chest was opened, connective tissue torn, the organ extracted still pulsing. Magdalena raised it high, blood dripping from her arms. She drank deeply, her eyes closed in ecstasy. The chalice was passed to Eliezer, then to the Hernandez brothers, then to the villagers. Each sip deepened complicity, chaining their souls to the goddess, will. Marta's ritual followed. She had initially tried to resist, screaming her objections, but no one came to help. Participation was mandatory. The villagers struck, cut, and scorched her, each strike reinforcing Magdalena's unyielding control. By the time her heart was removed, several villagers, even those who had resisted earlier, were trembling, their minds irrevocably broken. Diego, the child, was the most disturbing case yet. He was too young to understand fully, but that didn't matter. Magdalena claimed his innocence made him a potent conduit for divine favor. He was forced to participate in preliminary beatings, then tied to the altar. The cave fell silent as Eliezer performed the extraction. The boy's blood was collected, the chalice passed. Even the youngest villagers drank. Fear, drugs, and ritual had stripped them of instinctive horror. The psychological impact was devastating. Those who had once resisted, like Hector, were now silent observers. Their trauma was compounded by the constant witnessing of atrocities and the participation forced upon them. Some villagers had begun showing signs of sadistic anticipation, raising sticks or knives eagerly, no longer needing orders. The goddess had awakened something within them, a capacity for cruelty that had been latent until now. Magdalena herself grew bolder. She began experimenting with the combination of drugs, sleep deprivation, and extended ceremonies. Some rituals lasted through the night and into the day, exhausting participants entirely. She claimed the gods demanded complete devotion, and every villager knew that refusal meant death. Resistance was no longer an option, survival required submission. The blood rituals began to incorporate elements of spectacle. Victims were displayed, their deaths choreographed to reinforce fear and devotion. Families were forced to execute or assist in punishments for neighbors, teaching them that obedience and cruelty were intertwined. Children were made to participate, ensuring the next generation would continue the cycle of terror. As July progressed, Magdalena's delusions expanded further. She now claimed she could see the hearts of all villagers, identifying the impure instantly. Anyone who hesitated or showed doubt, even subtly, risked immediate selection. The community lived under constant scrutiny, paranoia consuming every thought. No one dared speak freely. Eye contact became a silent test of faith. Despite the terror, there were moments of subtle rebellion, though fleeting. A few villagers whispered in corners, questioning the rituals, dreaming of escape. But these murmurs were short-lived. Fear, addiction to the drugs, and the overwhelming authority of Magdalena extinguished even the smallest sparks of defiance. The village had descended into a complete cycle of horror, obedience, and ritualized violence. By the end of July, Yerba Buena was unrecognizable. Once a humble farming community, it had become a domain of fear and death. Magdalena had solidified her role as goddess, Eleazar her executor, and the villagers her obedient servants. The blood ritual had escalated beyond anything previously imagined, creating a culture of terror, complicity, and sadistic pleasure. Yet even as the village sank deeper into madness, small cracks remained. A few villagers continued to hope for escape or intervention. But in a place as isolated as Yerba Buena, hope was fragile, and Magdalena's growing power ensured that the slightest act of rebellion could become another public execution. The goddess' hunger for obedience and blood would not abate. Each night, she demanded more victims, more ritual, more devotion. And with each ceremony, the village was reshaped, minds broken, morality erased, until there was nothing left but fear, devotion, and the unthinkable acts the goddess commanded. This version emphasizes escalation of violence, psychological manipulation, and the villagers' moral collapse, setting the stage for Part 6, where rebellion, paranoia, and internal fractures could emerge. I can continue with Part 6, where Magdalena's control tightens further, rituals intensify, and cracks in the village's obedience begin to appear. Do you want me to continue with Part 6 next? Title: The Horrors of Yerba Buena, Part 6 Paranoia and Rebellion. Hook opening. By August, fear in Yerba Buena had become a living, breathing entity. But even the most broken minds have limits. Magdalena's delusions of godhood had consumed the village, yet whispers of rebellion began to stir. What happens when terror meets defiance in a place where survival depends on cruelty? Part 6 Paranoia and Rebellion. By early August, Magdalena's grip over Yerba Buena had reached its terrifying peak. The villagers lived in constant dread, their every thought and action scrutinized by the self-proclaimed goddess. Each ceremony pushed them further into moral collapse, each drop of blood consumed strengthening her power. The blood rituals now occurred almost nightly. Families brought their own children to witness the horrors, ensuring that terror and obedience were deeply ingrained from a young age. The psychological chains were nearly unbreakable. Yet, as the atrocities grew, so did small sparks of doubt among the villagers. Some began whispering in corners, sharing quiet questions about the goddess' intentions, about the morality of what they were doing. These whispers were dangerous. Magdalena claimed she could see into hearts and minds, detecting even the faintest trace of doubt. Any hesitation, any quiet word, could be used as evidence of heresy. Fear kept the villagers silent, but defiance had begun to flicker. One night, a small group of villagers secretly gathered in the shadows behind the main cave. They were terrified, aware that discovery meant certain death. But the horrors they had witnessed, the removal of hearts, the drinking of blood, the murder of their friends and neighbors, had pushed them to a point where some risk seemed better than continued submission. The leader of the group, a man named Hector who had lost his beloved Selena in the earlier rituals, had been quietly observing the goddess for weeks. He had seen her patterns, the way she staged ceremonies, the methods she used to instill terror. In his mind, he began to plan. Escape seemed impossible, but perhaps there was another way, a way to resist from within. Meanwhile, Magdalena had noticed subtle changes in the villagers' behavior. She claimed that the gods were displeased with some, and began selecting victims more arbitrarily. This unpredictability increased fear, but also frustration. Even the most compliant began to question why some were chosen and others spared. Magdalena's delusions grew. She now claimed that she could communicate directly with the gods through the blood of her victims. The more blood she consumed, the more visions she had, or so she claimed. She demanded larger and more elaborate ceremonies, incorporating multiple victims and complex rituals designed to impress the gods. The villagers were exhausted, yet they had no choice but to obey. In one ceremony, 3 victims were selected simultaneously: a young man named Raphael, a woman named Marta, and a child named Diego. The villagers, drugged and terrified, participated fully, striking, cutting, and scalding their neighbors as Magdalena circled them, chanting and gesturing like a goddess possessed. Eliezer performed the heart extractions, while Magdalena drank from the chalice of blood. Villagers, including children, were forced to sip from the chalice, reinforcing their complicity. The cave reeked of blood, smoke, and sweat, a suffocating miasma that blurred morality and reason. But in the shadows, Hector and a few others whispered plans of resistance. They had learned the goddess' routines, her reliance on the Hernandez brothers and her own brother, Eliezer, for physical control. If they could disrupt the hierarchy, even briefly, they might create a chance for escape or sabotage. Their first attempt was cautious. During a small ritual, they subtly shifted the positions of torches and prepared crude weapons from farming tools. It was not a direct attack but a test of courage. Magdalena noticed only slight irregularities, but interpreted them as the signs of her growing power, claims that the gods were revealing hidden threats. She increased her surveillance, heightening tension. Meanwhile, paranoia spread among the villagers. The goddess' claims of omniscience made even the most loyal hesitate. Friends and neighbors suspected each other of secret rebellion. Some began reporting minor missteps to avoid suspicion, feeding the cycle of terror. The psychological collapse was deepening. Hector realized that the village's only chance was to use fear against Magdalena. He observed how dependent she had become on the drugged rituals, the ceremonies, and the power displayed during sacrifices. If those structures could be interrupted, her control might weaken. But attempting such a move required courage beyond what most villagers could muster. One evening, Magdalena announced an unprecedented ritual. She demanded 2 entire families participate in the blood ceremony simultaneously. The families were terrified, but they complied. The cave filled with smoke, the ritual began, and the horrors intensified. But during the ceremony, Hector and his small group executed their plan. They created distractions, sabotaged the torches, and caused confusion. For a brief moment, the goddess' divine image faltered. Villagers froze, unsure of what to do, their fear and awe colliding. Magdalena screamed, claiming the gods were angered, but for the first time, the villagers hesitated. That pause was dangerous, yet exhilarating. It showed that even in the darkest depths, fear could be manipulated. Resistance, however small, had entered the equation. Despite the brief disruption, Magdalena quickly regained control. She intensified the rituals, selecting more victims, forcing the villagers to recommit fully. But the seed of rebellion had been planted. A few villagers began questioning openly, whispering about escape routes, watching for moments of weakness in the goddess' behavior. By the end of August, Yerba Buena had become a village teetering on the edge. Terror, blood, and delusion ruled daily life, but cracks were forming. Small acts of defiance, subtle resistance, and whispered plans suggested that Magdalena's absolute control was not invincible. The blood rituals continued, but now a dangerous undercurrent existed. Fear still dominated, but hope, however fragile, had begun to emerge. The villagers had seen the goddess falter, and that glimpse of imperfection gave them a glimmer of possibility. Hector and his group knew that the next weeks could determine their survival. Magdalena's delusions would only grow more extreme, her demands more violent. But if they could exploit her arrogance and overconfidence, they might finally find a way to strike back, to reclaim a sliver of their humanity, and perhaps even escape the nightmare of Yerba Buena. The village was no longer just a place of death and fear. It was a battlefield of wills, a struggle between absolute domination and the fragile spark of rebellion. And in the darkness, the gods, or the illusions of gods, watched silently as the human mind bent, broke, and occasionally resisted. This version emphasizes the rise of paranoia, seeds of rebellion, and the intensifying psychological pressure, setting the stage for Part 7, where the conflict between the goddess and the villagers escalates even further, and the first real attempt at escape or resistance begins. I can continue with part 7 next, where the rebellion develops, tension rises, and the rituals grow even more horrifying. Do you want me to continue with part 7? Title: The Horrors of Yerba Buena, Part 7 Rebellion in the Shadows. Hook. Opening. Fear had ruled Yerba Buena for months, but even the most terrifying rain has cracks. Small sparks of resistance had begun to flicker. What happens when the oppressed start to fight back in a village dominated by a delusional goddess and rituals of unimaginable horror? Part 7 Rebellion in the Shadows. By September, Magdalena's rule over Yerba Buena had become absolute in appearance. Every villager lived in terror of selection, of her wrath, and of the blood rituals that had become increasingly brutal. Each night, sacrifices continued. The cave reeked of blood, sweat, and smoke, the metallic odor of previous victims mingling with the dense haze of peyote and marijuana. Sleep-deprived, drugged, and terrified, the villagers obeyed unquestioningly. But in the darkness, small seeds of defiance were growing. Hector, haunted by Selena's death and the atrocities he had witnessed, had quietly organized a small group of villagers willing to risk everything. They met in secret, whispering plans in the corners of the village, studying Magdalena's patterns, observing the Hernandez brothers, and seeking any weakness in the goddess' delusions. The group knew the odds were nearly impossible. Magdalena had absolute authority over the villagers' minds, bolstered by fear, drugs, and trauma. Elizar's skill with knives ensured no physical resistance would be easy. Yet the spark of rebellion persisted. One night, during a particularly gruesome blood ritual, Magdalena selected 3 victims. This time, she escalated her demands. The victims were tied to the altar, beaten, cut, and scorched as usual. But the ritual was disrupted by a sudden distraction. Hector and 2 others had loosened some of the torches and created a small smoke flare near the back of the cave. It was a brief chaos, but enough to cause hesitation. The villagers froze. Fear battled confusion. Magdalena, screaming that the gods were angered, attempted to regain control, but the momentary lapse revealed her vulnerability. For the first time, the villagers saw the goddess as fallible, human. Even the children, drugged and indoctrinated, sensed the falter in authority. Encouraged by this, Hector devised a plan. Over the next few days, they smuggled small farming tools and rocks, hidden under bundles of corn. Each day, they practiced in secret, preparing for a moment when they could act decisively. Magdalena, meanwhile, grew increasingly erratic. Her delusions deepened. She claimed the gods demanded more blood, more sacrifices, more devotion. The rituals became longer, more complex, designed to exhaust and subdue. Villagers were forced to participate in multiple ceremonies each night, often without rest, feeding Magdalena's growing megalomania. But the rebellion also grew bolder. A young woman named Isabel, whose brother had been sacrificed, began secretly encouraging others to question the goddess' authority. Small acts of sabotage occurred, tools misplaced, torches dimmed, subtle gestures of defiance during ceremonies. Each act was dangerous but gave the villagers a sense of agency they had not felt in months. The critical moment came in mid-September. Magdalena demanded a special ritual, claiming that the gods were dissatisfied with the entire village. She ordered 5 villagers to be sacrificed simultaneously, chosen at random. The tension in the cave was almost unbearable. Hector and his group were ready. They had prepared ropes, stones, and crude weapons. Their plan was not to kill Magdalena, that would have been impossible, but to create confusion, to free at least some of the victims, and to escape into the mountains. As the ritual began, the group executed their plan. A flare of smoke created a sudden panic. Some villagers froze, others looked around in confusion. The 5 victims hesitated, uncertain if they should obey or resist. In the chaos, Hector seized one victim and pulled them away from the altar. The group shouted, rallying those willing to follow. Magdalena screamed in fury, claiming that the gods were punishing them. Her voice, once commanding, now cracked with rage. Eleazar tried to restrain the rebels, but in the confusion, several villagers broke free from their bonds. The cave erupted into chaos, a clash of fear, desperation, and defiance. The escape was only partial. Some villagers were recaptured, and the ritual resumed with heightened brutality. But for the first time, Magdalena faced open resistance. Her image as an invincible goddess began to crack. Fear was still powerful, but the villagers now understood that rebellion, however dangerous, was possible. Afterward, the village was shaken. Magdalena demanded loyalty and devotion, punishing those who had attempted escape. But the seed of doubt had been planted. Whispered conversations spread through the village, subtle acts of defiance continued, and even some of her most loyal followers began to question her. Hector's group realized that control relied on continuous terror. If they could find another moment to disrupt a ceremony, to free victims and challenge the rituals, they might expand the rebellion. Yet they also understood the stakes. Failure meant death, often a gruesome one, and participation in the blood rituals ensured complicity that weighed heavily on their souls. By the end of September, Yerba Buena was no longer a village completely under the goddess' control. Fear remained, blood had been spilled, and atrocities continued. But beneath the surface, the villagers were quietly planning, learning how to manipulate fear, and beginning to take the first steps toward reclaiming their freedom. Magdalena, however, remained dangerously delusional. She increased her rituals, intensified the blood ceremonies, and insisted that every villager recommit to her as a goddess. The intensity of horror grew, but so did the villagers, understanding of her weaknesses. In the shadows, Hector and his allies whispered strategies, watching the goddess, studying the caves, and planning the moment when they could finally strike decisively. The stage was set for a confrontation that could change everything. Yerba Buena had become a village where fear and blood ruled, but rebellion had begun. The question now was whether the villagers could survive long enough to challenge the goddess, or whether Magdalena's delusions and the blood rituals would consume them all. This version emphasizes the first real rebellion, tension between fear and resistance, and Magdalena's cracks in control, setting up Part 8, where the villagers' plans escalate and the stakes rise even further. I can continue with Part 8 next, where the rebellion grows, and the goddess' tyranny begins to face serious challenges. Do you want me to continue with Part 8? Title: The Horrors of Yerba Buena, Part 8. The Rebellion Unfolds. Hook opening. The darkness in Yerba Buena had ruled for months, but whispers of rebellion had grown louder. Fear still gripped the villagers, yet courage, however fragile, was stirring. Could ordinary people rise against a delusional goddess whose power had been built on blood, terror, and manipulation? Part 8. The Rebellion Unfolds. By October, Yerba Buena had become a village trapped between horror and hope. Magdalena's rituals had grown even more extreme. She demanded multiple sacrifices at once and forced everyone, young and old, to participate in the blood ceremonies. The cave reeked of blood, drugs, sweat, and burning incense. The psychological chains seemed unbreakable. Yet the villagers, quietly inspired by Hector and a small group of rebels, were no longer completely obedient. Subtle acts of defiance had grown into coordinated plans. Every whispered word, every shared observation of the goddess' routines, was carefully passed among a few brave souls. They were determined to survive, to reclaim even a small piece of humanity. Hector had learned that Magdalena relied on predictability. She followed specific patterns during ceremonies, depended on the Hernandez brothers for support, and was intoxicated with a mix of drugs and adulation. He realized that if they could disrupt the structure, even briefly, chaos could work in their favor. The group spent days preparing. They hid rocks, sticks, and crude farming tools in baskets and bundles, carefully timing their movements so the goddess and her loyalists would not notice. Even the children were subtly trained to avoid certain areas, staying out of the line of fire while the rebels planned. On a moonless night, Magdalena announced the largest blood ceremony yet. She claimed that the gods were growing impatient and demanded a spectacular ritual. 5 villagers were selected, chosen seemingly at random, their fates sealed. The cave was filled with smoke and chanting, the villagers trembling with fear, yet ready to act. Hector and his group sprang into motion. They had prepared a diversion, a small smoke flare near the rear of the cave, designed to distract both Magdalena and Eliezer long enough to free one of the victims. As the ritual began, the flare erupted, filling the cave with a thick, acrid smoke. Shouts and screams erupted, confusion taking over the crowd. For the first time, the villagers hesitated. Many froze, unsure whether to follow orders or flee. Magdalena screamed, claiming the gods were angry, but her voice now trembled. Her divine image faltered, and for a brief moment, fear shifted to uncertainty. Hector moved quickly. He grabbed one of the victims, pulling them from the altar. Others in the rebel group followed, snatching a second and third victim. Chaos spread through the cave. The blood ceremony was interrupted, torches were toppled, and screams echoed in the smoke-filled chamber. Magdalena roared, enraged and disoriented. She claimed the gods demanded obedience and threatened the villagers with fire and death. Yet the hesitation, the rebellion, had already taken root. Even some of her most loyal followers paused, unsure whether to act. Fear battled awe, and for the first time, awe wavered. Outside the cave, the villagers who had not been chosen to participate watched in silence, tense and uncertain. The rebels led the freed victims toward the edge of the village, using knowledge of hidden paths and rock formations to avoid detection. The escape was chaotic and dangerous, but it was a first victory, a crack in the goddess' armor. Inside the cave, Magdalena attempted to regain control. She demanded blood, loyalty, and obedience, escalating the intensity of the rituals. Her delusions intensified. She claimed she could see betrayal in every shadow, every glance. Her voice became shrill, unpredictable, yet no longer fully commanding. Hector and the rebels used this window to plan further. They realized the villagers' fear could now be turned into a weapon. They began spreading small messages, encouraging subtle disobedience, signaling that escape and defiance were possible. Every tiny act, every hesitation during ceremonies, chipped away at Magdalena's control. Meanwhile, the psychological strain on the villagers grew. Those who had participated in earlier blood rituals carried immense guilt, yet their desire to survive pushed them toward cautious defiance. Even children, once entirely obedient, now understood the fragility of the goddess' power. By mid-October, a sense of tension dominated Yerba Buena. The village was no longer entirely under the goddess' control. Fear remained, but rebellion had begun to spread. Whispers of escape routes circulated quietly. Small acts of sabotage, torches dimmed, tools misplaced, undermined the goddess' authority. Magdalena noticed these changes. Her paranoia intensified. She punished some villagers brutally to reassert dominance, yet each act of cruelty further eroded loyalty. Fear alone could no longer maintain total control. The village was slowly slipping from her grasp. Hector and his group began planning a larger operation. They would need to free more victims, disrupt multiple ceremonies, and ideally confront Magdalena directly. They knew the risks were enormous. Failure could mean death, often violent, and those involved in blood rituals bore the weight of complicity that made hesitation dangerous. Despite the danger, the spark of resistance had ignited. Villagers began to understand that survival depended on subtle defiance, clever planning, and exploiting the goddess' own weaknesses. The final challenge was clear. The rebellion would either grow strong enough to challenge Magdalena and the Hernandez brothers or be crushed before it could fully manifest. Every whisper, every secret action, carried the weight of life and death. Yerba Buena had become more than a village of terror. It was now a battlefield of wills. The oppressed were learning to navigate fear, horror, and manipulation, preparing for a confrontation that could either free them or annihilate them. The blood rituals continued, but the balance of power was shifting. The goddess' illusions of divinity were weakening, while the villagers' courage, however fragile, was rising. The stage was set for a climax that would determine the fate of every person trapped in the Sierra Madre Oriental. This version emphasizes the escalation of the rebellion, the cracks in Magdalena's control, and the villagers' first real successes, setting the stage for Part 9, where the final confrontation and climax of the horrors unfold. I can continue with Part 9 next, where rebellion, terror, and survival collide in a dramatic turning point. Do you want me to continue with Part 9? Title: The Horrors of Yerba Buena, Part 9 The Goddess Falls. Hook opening. Fear had ruled Yerba Buena for months, but the villagers had discovered cracks in Magdalena's power. Now, rebellion and terror collided. Could a community built on blood, drugs, and terror finally reclaim itself, or would the goddess, madness consume everyone? Part 9 The Goddess Falls. By late October, the tension in Yerba Buena was palpable. The villagers were exhausted, drugged, and traumatized, but they were also alert. The small victories of Hector and his allies had given hope. Even children who had once hidden in fear now watched closely, learning patterns and movements of the goddess and the Hernandez brothers. Magdalena, however, remained dangerously delusional. She claimed visions from the gods and insisted that the blood rituals must continue nightly, with increasing frequency. Each ritual had grown more elaborate, cruel, and exhausting. Fear was her weapon, but it had begun to lose its absolute hold. Hector knew that the final confrontation would be dangerous. He and the rebels studied every detail, the location of weapons, the layout of the cave, the timing of rituals, and Magdalena's behavior. They knew the goddess' power depended on the obedience and terror of the villagers. Disrupt that, and the illusion could crumble. The plan was simple, in theory but deadly in execution. During the next major blood ceremony, Hector and the rebels would create chaos, free as many victims as possible, and confront Magdalena directly. The villagers who had quietly resisted were now ready to act. Fear remained, but survival instincts had strengthened. On the night of the ceremony, the cave was packed. Smoke filled the air, incense burned thickly, and chanting echoed off the walls. Magdalena stood at the altar, adorned in her white tunic stained with previous blood rituals. Eliezer was nearby, blade in hand, ready to perform the gruesome acts the goddess demanded. The first phase of the plan began. A small smoke flare was ignited in the back of the cave, creating confusion and panic. Magdalena screamed that the gods were angry, waving her arms, but the rebels had anticipated this. They moved quickly, grabbing victims and guiding them toward hidden exits. Chaos erupted. Some villagers froze, unsure whether to obey or flee. Others, emboldened by months of subtle resistance, joined the rebels in pulling people away from the altar. The cave was filled with shouts, screams, and the sound of overturned torches. For the first time, Magdalena's authority faltered. Hector confronted Magdalena directly. "It's over," he shouted, his voice echoing in the smoke-filled chamber. "No more sacrifices. No more blood rituals. You are not a goddess." Magdalena laughed, a high, manic sound that echoed off the walls. "The gods are watching," she screamed. "You cannot defy me." But her voice trembled. Fear flickered in her eyes. The villagers, once petrified, now stood together. Some held tools, some stones, and some simply their courage. The illusion of divinity had begun to shatter. Eliezer lunged to defend his sister, but several villagers restrained him. They were no longer acting out of simple terror, they were driven by desperation, anger, and a desire for survival. The knives, once symbols of oppression, were now turned back against the source of horror. The confrontation grew violent. Magdalena screamed, threw objects, and tried to assert control, but the villagers would not yield. Every step she took was met with resistance. Every command was ignored or defied. She was no longer a goddess, she was a frightened, human woman, isolated in her delusion. During the chaos, Hector freed several of the bound victims. Some were adults, others children, who had been forced to participate in the blood rituals. The freed villagers joined the fight against the goddess, remaining loyalists. Shouts filled the cave as control shifted from Magdalena to the rebels. Finally, cornered and unable to command fear as she once had, Magdalena fell to the ground. Her white tunic was torn, her hair matted with sweat and blood, her delusions collapsing under the reality of human defiance. She screamed at the villagers, claiming vengeance from the gods, but no one listened. Hector approached cautiously. He did not strike. The goddess had been stripped of power by her own methods. Fear, manipulation, and cruelty had been her tools, and now they had failed. The villagers, who had endured months of terror, now held the upper hand. Eliezer, realizing that his sister's control was gone, tried to flee, but Hector and the rebels stopped him. Both siblings were captured and bound, their reign of horror finally over. The villagers, some trembling, some crying, began to understand that the nightmare could end. The aftermath was grim. The cave smelled of blood and smoke, of months of rituals and suffering. Bodies remained, evidence of the atrocities that had occurred. Villagers moved slowly, some vomiting, others too shocked to speak. Trauma lingered, but freedom had been regained. Magdalena and Eliezer were handed over to authorities in Villa Gran, the nearby town. Investigations began, revealing the extent of the horrors. Dozens of murders, systematic sexual abuse, drugged ceremonies, and the exploitation of a community trapped by geography, fear, and manipulation. The villagers of Yerba Buena were left to rebuild their lives. Many would carry scars, physical, psychological, and emotional, for the rest of their days. Yet there was also a spark of hope. They had survived, resisted, and reclaimed their humanity from the grip of a delusional goddess and the men who had supported her. Yerba Buena, once a village of terror, became a cautionary tale. A place where fear and manipulation nearly destroyed an entire community, but where resilience, courage, and unity proved stronger than cruelty. Even months later, survivors spoke of the nights of horror, of the blood rituals, and of Magdalena's terrifying descent into madness. They remembered not just the pain, but the strength they discovered in themselves. The story of Yerba Buena would live on, not as a legend of fear, but as a lesson in human resilience and the power of collective courage. This version focuses on the climax of rebellion, confrontation with Magdalena, and the initial aftermath, leading naturally into Part 10, where survivors reflect and the final resolution unfolds. I can now create Part 10, the dramatic and reflective conclusion of the entire Yerba Buena story. Do you want me to continue with Part 10? Title: The Horrors of Yerba Buena, Part 10 After the Blood. Hook opening. Yerba Buena had endured months of unimaginable horror. The goddess had fallen, the rituals had ended, and survivors were left to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives. But what remains after fear has ruled completely? What scars linger when humanity itself has been tested to its limits? Part 10 After the Blood. The dawn after Magdalena's fall brought silence to Yerba Buena. The caves, once echoing with chants, screams, and the grinding rituals of terror, now stood empty and cold. Smoke and incense lingered in the air, but there was no divine presence, no screams, no ritual. Only survivors. Villagers stepped cautiously from their hiding places. They had lived under a delusional goddess who demanded blood and obedience, who turned parents against children, friends against friends. They had followed orders, and in doing so, many had crossed lines that could never be uncrossed. Now, they were free, but freedom felt alien. Hector moved among them, helping the weak and injured. His own body bore scratches and bruises from the chaotic final ceremony, yet his spirit was stronger than ever. He realized that survival was only the first step. The real challenge would be living after months of manipulation, fear, and trauma. Authorities from Villa Gran arrived days later, summoned by a few brave villagers who had managed to escape during the chaos. They were unprepared for what they would find. Evidence of systematic murder, sexual abuse, and horrifying rituals filled the caves and the surrounding village. Bodies, partially burned or hidden, testified to atrocities that seemed impossible. Magdalena and Eliezer were captured, their delusions exposed. Magdalena screamed at investigators, claiming the gods were angry, that she was still Kotliku. Eliezer tried to justify their actions, but the truth was undeniable. Months of manipulation, murder, and exploitation could not be hidden. The villagers, however, were no longer entirely victims. In the aftermath, many spoke with a mix of fear and courage. They recounted the horrors, the ceremonies, the moments when they had been forced to harm friends and family. Tears were shed for lost loved ones, for innocence stolen, for lives forever changed. Yet within these testimonies, there was also a glimmer of resilience. Survivors described small acts of rebellion during Magdalena's reign. Whispered words of defiance, secret efforts to save victims, subtle delays in obedience, all had contributed to the eventual fall of the goddess. It was proof that even in the darkest times, human courage could persist. The rebuilding process was slow. Families returned to farming, to simple routines, but the psychological scars were profound. Children who had observed or participated in rituals struggled to understand morality, justice, and safety. Adults wrestled with guilt and trauma. Therapy was unavailable, and traditional authorities had little experience dealing with such horrors. Yet some changes were lasting and positive. Villagers formed committees to protect each other, to ensure no outsider could exploit them again. Education, once considered a luxury, became a priority for those who survived. The lessons of Yerba Buena extended beyond fear, they became lessons of vigilance, unity, and resilience. The story of Magdalena and the blood ritual spread beyond the mountains. Villa Gran authorities published records, newspapers recounted the events, and eventually, Yerba Buena became infamous. Scholars, psychologists, and journalists examined the village as a case study in human manipulation, fear, and the dangerous power of unchecked authority. Even years later, survivors would speak of the night Magdalena fell. Some described it as liberation. Others, haunted by memories of their participation in unspeakable acts, called it the beginning of a lifetime of recovery. What no one could deny was the extraordinary human endurance displayed by those who survived. Hector, having witnessed both horror and rebellion, became a quiet figure of guidance in the village. He reminded others that the true danger had been the psychological control Magdalena had exerted, and that vigilance, critical thinking, and community solidarity were essential defenses against manipulation. Yerba Buena's caves remained empty, silent witnesses to past atrocities. Travelers and locals avoided them, sensing the lingering aura of violence. Yet survivors used these same caves to teach new generations about the dangers of blind obedience, the importance of questioning authority, and the resilience of the human spirit. The legacy of Yerba Buena is complex. It is a story of horror, certainly, a community manipulated to commit acts beyond ordinary comprehension. But it is also a story of courage, resistance, and eventual triumph over fear. Those who survived learned, painfully, that humanity can be both fragile and astonishingly strong. As the sun set over the Sierra Madre Oriental, the village stood quiet but alive. Children played again, farmers tended fields without fear, and the air, once thick with terror, carried the faint hope of a future built on awareness and solidarity. The shadow of Magdalena remained, a warning etched into memory. But it no longer ruled. Yerba Buena's story reminds us that human beings are capable of both darkness and light. Fear can corrupt, but courage, however small, can ignite change. In the end, it was the villagers' bravery, their refusal to remain passive, that ended the reign of terror and allowed life to continue. For anyone watching, remember this: stories like Yerba Buena are more than horror tales. They are lessons about vigilance, resilience, and the limits of human influence. The past may be dark, but the choices of the present can shape a better future. If you found this story compelling, subscribe to the channel. Share this investigation with others so the lessons of Yerba Buena are remembered. Leave a comment below and tell us what you would have done in the face of such terror.